Well, guys, I'd like to get started, and I want to start with a couple of announcements. First of all, I reopened Quiz 4, so it'll be available through Friday because I got a number of different issues. One is that some people didn't submit their assignment. There are a couple that I have either a blank PDF or I have something else like bad entry or something. Anyway, go back and check and submit it before the end of the week, and we'll go from there. I don't know, the way things look, it may have been an internet issue. It could have been something wrong with the system because there were too many of them that it was just messed up. So anyway, check it, submit it, and we'll go from there. Second announcement, no class on Monday. It's our Easter break / spring break. And so I want to remind you of that, just in case. And so let me show you about art after the Second World War. And let's do the slideshow. And like much of this course so far, we've been focused on European art. It's what the book has. It's kind of the orthodox way of looking at art. And for many of those centuries, for a number of those centuries, there really wasn't much going on in the Western world, North America, South America, so on. So anyway, there was native cultures, and we'll look at those a little bit later in this course. But I have to start, before I say anything about the artwork, I want to tell you really what the political situation was about. On Monday, I showed you that slide about the degenerate art. Hitler and his Nazis put together a bunch of modern art. They exhibited under the title Degenerate Art. It was basically a slam. It was decried. Modernism was decried as being a fraud, and it was politically unacceptable. It was part of a degrading culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as such, when the Nazis started the Second World War in Europe, a lot of the artists who were practicing modernism, especially those doing things like Dada, Expressionism, Surrealism, and so forth, a lot of them had to leave. They would have been thrown into concentration camps and probably never heard from ever again. There were a couple of artists who did not flee. Pablo Picasso stayed in France, as did Henri Matisse. But by that point, in 1940, 1939, those artists were so well known, recognized universally, that the Nazis really couldn't do anything to them without repercussions. And so a lot of artists left, a lot of scientists left, a lot of philosophers and other kinds of people who were in what you might call the cultural elite, the smart people, the writers, the thinkers, the doers. A lot of them left because the Nazis would kill them. And so where did they go? A lot of them came to the United States. Talking about thinkers, one of the smartest people in recorded history, Albert Einstein, came to the United States and spent the rest of his life teaching and researching at Princeton University in New Jersey. Others that came over, many surrealists came over. Surrealists came over, and probably the one that is the most famous, Salvador Dali, he came to the United States, was here for the war, and kind of maintained a relationship with the US. As a matter of fact, if you go on YouTube, you can find a clip of Salvador Dali on What's My Line, which was a game show in the 1950s. So Salvador Dali was here, as were almost all of the surrealists. And they brought a lot of influence with them. And basically, when they arrived in the US, the Americans rolled out the red carpet, the proverbial red carpet treatment. And so they were kind of the big men on campus, if you will. And so they brought a lot of their surrealist ideas with them to the US. And so that's where the story begins. World War II, we got the fascists in Europe, and they're trying to wipe out modernism. We have America, land of the free, and they are accepting all of these refugees. And so I'll show you a little bit about what was happening in Europe right after World War II. And it's not like after the war, Europeans stopped making art. And in fact, some European artists started their careers after the war. And this is Alberto Giacometti, and it's Man Pointing number 5. And he was a guy who made these figures out of bronze, and they're typically very thin. They're elongated. They're almost like expressionism in sculpture. And there was a burgeoning philosophy in Europe at the time called existentialism. And Giacometti was somebody who the existentialists really pointed to as some artist, as an artist who embodied their beliefs. I could go on all day about this one, but bottom line is that we got sculptors working, and I want to point out, this is at the Des Moines Art Center, just saying. Francis Bacon painting, 1946. And he's from England, and he is an expressionist too. And this is like kind of typical of his paintings. And he kind of puts together a lot of images. And one of the images he relies on a lot is these sides of beef. And it's almost as though you go into a slaughterhouse and you see these cow carcasses hanging, and you see the meat, the ribs, the fat. They've been skinned, they've been gutted, and they're ready to be cut up into various cuts of beef. That's why they call them cuts of beef. Steaks, rump roast, whatever, whatever's left, hamburger, etc. But at any rate, there were a lot of people that likened these images that he shows in his work to the carnage that Europeans experienced in the Second World War. Now, carnage is, if you trace the root word, the Latin, and you talk about carnivore, carnivore is a creature that eats animal bodies. And then you talk about dead animal bodies and you talk carnage. You see, it kind of all ties together. And typically what you see in his work too is these hints of people screaming, sometimes referencing clergy. But at any rate, expressionism and a touch of psychology in there. Psychology used to enhance the expressionistic message. And so here's another Francis Bacon. Here you go, Figure with Meat, 1954. You got here somebody is sitting in what appears to be something of a throne. Could be clergy. Kind of looks like a lot of those portraits of clergy that we've seen through the centuries of Caravaggio and Velázquez and so on and so on. And the sides of beef. Now, people have analyzed this work and talked about it in a lot of different ways, but one of the interesting aspects of this painting is that the negative space here forms, can you see it? Something resembling a chalice. What a chalice is, it's a cup used in religious ceremonies. A chalice is what we consecrate the blood of Christ in the Catholic Church. You fill it with wine, bless it, and the recipients of communion drink from this chalice. So anyway, religious iconography, carnage, carnivores, it's all there. Dubuffet, another guy who stayed actually through the occupation of France. And he was somebody who really kind of liked the ideas of surrealism. And if you think of surrealism as something that a kind of art that's going for the thoughts that are going on in our subconsciousness, like dreamscape painters, Dali and so on, dreaming about those melted clocks, the ants, the flies, painting about the subconscious mind. You think about people like Miro doing automatic drawing and painting, accessing the subconscious mind. And Dubuffet was really very interested in that, but he kind of took a different approach. He said, and he's very much quoted, we used to do 2 or 3 lectures on Dubuffet because it's really very rich and it's very deep. But what he theorized was that this idea of going for the subconscious mind, the route to that experience might be in emulating children's art or the art of the insane or other people that have not, as he would say, been contaminated with art training. People who are drawing and painting that have not been taught how to draw or paint. And so you can see the figures in here. If you look at it very carefully, you can see a figure there, here, over here, down here. Uneasy life. But you also see it's kind of random in how it's put together too. Dubuffet loved looking at children's art, and he visited what at the time we would call insane asylums. Today we would call them a mental hospital, I suppose. But bottom line is that he was deeply interested in looking at that art as a way to reach the unconscious, the subconscious mind. And so what we see in Europe is a mix of expressionism and surrealism. Simply put, those were the 2 major themes of European art immediately after the war. And here is another artist, Gerhard Richter. And this is kind of out of sequence, but you see here, this is a cityscape. It's a townscape, Paris, and it's painted in an extremely gestural, very loose manner. Richter's career is broad and lengthy, and we have many examples of Gerhard Richter at St. Louis Art Museum. I told you about Max Beckmann being well represented in the slam. Richter is too. And Richter's really kind of a guy that looks at the entirety of art history, but especially modernism. And he kind of goes through all of these phases. So he's got this phase of loose gestural cityscape work. He's got another phase where he produces work that's photorealistic. And then he has what they call the squeegee paintings, which are huge, massive paintings where the paint's been poured on and then pulled across the canvas with a squeegee that looks a lot like abstract expressionism. So Richter is a big, well-known European artist, and this one painting does not describe the entirety of his career. But suffice it to say that art continues after the war. But a lot of scholars, a lot of art historians have written that because of World War II and the exodus of so many great artists to New York because of the war, that the center of Western art shifted. And so you might imagine if we have a world war as devastating, as life-changing as the Second World War, it would have its consequences. And these artists brought their ideas, but the Americans were, at this time, there were a group of Americans that were kind of tired of playing second fiddle to European art. And they wanted to break through, and they wanted to do something even bolder, more daring, more, I hate to use this, but more creative than what had been going on in Europe at the time. And those artists that were working in the 40s, and some who had embraced surrealism and actually hung out with the surrealists as they were here, they became known as the abstract expressionist. And so I just showed you European art and this kind of idea of surrealism and this kind of idea, this underlying theme of expressionism. And so here we go. Here's what happens in New York. So before I go to the next slide, I want to remind you that basically what we have studied so far about European art is that Florence was the center of the art world. 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. By the 18th century, a lot of this shifted to Paris. 18th, 19th century belonged to the French, and the first half of the 20th. But because of the war, the center of gravity in the art world, in the Western art world, moves to New York. And so when the surrealists arrived on our shores, one of the first things that they did was that they were interested in what American artists were doing. And you guys, many of you who are artists, would probably do the same thing. You're curious, you want to see what your peers are doing. You want to exchange ideas. You want to find out what's happening. And so they did, and one of the people they found right off the bat was this guy, Arshile Gorky. And I can describe his work this way. I'm hoping you'll follow. Automatic drawing, much in the vein or the style of Miro. The idea of going in front of a canvas and just doing random movements and marks, and then coming back in and painting into the drawing. That's the method. It's called automatic drawing. There's an idea about automatism that the surrealists brought with them to New York. And that is that the automatism was a way of accessing that subconscious mind. I've told you that. There's a lot of other people that kind of say, you know, really, the subconscious mind is accessed in a lot of ways. And I got to tell you, because the work of the psychologist Carl Jung and the theories of the universal subconscious are even more developed than they by the 1940s than they were in the 1920s and 30s. And so it's kind of believed that universal subconscious manifests itself in many different kinds of ways. Prayer and chanting is a way of connecting with the universal subconsciousness. And so it becomes kind of a layperson's metaphor or synonym of the spiritual, God, universal subconsciousness, and awareness that that is there. And people who do meditation get closer to God and closer to this universal subconsciousness. And so that's why you might go up in the mountains and eat some peyote buttons and meditate for a week. Or you might go to the Himalayas and go to a monastery and not talk to anyone. We've been doing that in Christianity with the monasteries and other kinds of things. In the Islamic culture, they have what is called Sufi mysticism. And so anyway, there's this idea that this universal subconsciousness is actually a lot more universal than anyone initially imagined. And so anyway, this was the way to get there. Automatic drawing. And they saw Gorky's work and they fell in love with Gorky, and Gorky became a famous artist. I want to mention too, I think it's on Amazon. There's a documentary about Gorky. It's really kind of good. It talks to it gives the outline of his career, talks to his survivors, his kids, and so on. Anyway, bottom line, surrealists were thrilled. And so Americans like this guy, Jackson Pollock, they weren't really satisfied with doing what the Europeans were doing. They were kind of getting to the same place, but they wanted a different route. And so instead of automatic drawing, Pollock engages in automatic painting. And that is where he gets buckets of paint and he puts a stick or a brush in the paint and slings it all over the place, all over the canvas. As a matter of fact, these canvases are laid on the ground and he slings paint over and around and so on. And so he has done away with an important part of this automatic drawing, and that is the idea of doing automatic drawing and then consciously coming back in and painting. This was all at one motion, if you will. It was automatism and it was painting at the same time. And as I was saying just a moment ago, the idea that the universal subconsciousness was a lot more universal than originally imagined. Pollock talked about that. He talked about Hopi sand painters, Hopi, Native American, shamanistic, take colored sand and pour it out and create images. And there's a lot of other Aboriginal paintings, paintings of South Asia, et cetera, et cetera. Bottom line, Jackson Pollock breaks through. He's come up, built on other ideas, has come up with a new thing, and it's drip paintings. And so here is a picture of Pollock doing exactly what I was telling you about. This guy, Hans Nemuth, if you ever do research on abstract expressionism, you will see this guy's name a lot. He did a lot of photography and did some motion pictures, movie film about abstract expressionism. He was primarily the guy that documented what these New York artists had been doing. And so here he is, and he's doing his painting. You see a finished one hanging up on the wall. You see one in an initial stage of creation. And so America, in a lot of ways, was not ready for this kind of art, especially this kind of art being made by Americans. And so there were a few, people that really understood what was going on. A lot of people didn't. But he was a major force, as it says here, in the abstract expressionist movement. And so as a result, Life magazine, I've mentioned that a couple of times in here already. Life magazine did a piece on him with talking about, is this America's greatest living artist? And so that was like huge. But the article exposed Jackson Pollock to the larger population. It was also contained a little bit of sarcasm and ridicule, and they called him Jack the Dripper. And so these are images. This is what I got. Just a screenshot. And so he said it was a dark and moody maverick. He was undeniably an innovative artistic genius and more. His technique has been carefully studied and has been determined that some works contain properties of mathematical fractals, and that the works become more fractal-like chronologically. So I've been around a while. That's kind of a theory that's only emerged in the 21st century, and it comes out of Australia. And there was a physics guy, physics professor, very well-noted professor of physics, and he noticed the fractal patterns in Pollock's work. You guys know what fractals are? Has this been covered in math? Not talking, eh? Well, let me tell you about fractals. Fractals are things that the pieces of the thing resemble the overall structure of the entire thing. I know that's confusing. But for instance, fractals exist in nature all over the place. Take a floret of broccoli, the green part. It's got a stalk, it's got all the good fuzzy green on the top. Well, if you take a little piece of that broccoli floret and look at it, and especially look at it with a magnifying glass, each little piece looks like the broccoli stalk that you pulled it from. That is a fractal, where the components look like the whole. And so these drips have that characteristic. And the guy from the University of New South Wales figured this out because he was a fan of Jackson Pollock. As a matter of fact, the National Gallery in Australia has coveted Jackson Pollock painting. They paid $3 million for it, and a lot of people thought that was foolery, a waste of money. But it inspired this physicist to look at it mathematically. And so anyway, they use fractal analysis to identify whether a drip painting is an authentic Pollock. Secondly, nobody's still figured out how he did that. So Pollock, he's like the king. He's the first American to wear the crown of greatest artist in the world, greatest living artist. He unfortunately was an alcoholic, and he died in a car crash. in 1956. If you want to know more about his life, you should look at, and I think you can find this streaming on one of the pay for premium channels, movie called Pollock. It's from around the turn of the century, right about when you guys were born. And it stars Ed Harris as Jackson Pollock and Marcia Gay Harden as this person, his wife, Lee Krasner. And she was a painter too. And you see this is 1957. While Pollock was enjoying all of the fame, the celebrity, the adulation at the height of his career, basically Lee Krasner gave up her career as a painter to help promote her husband. But upon his death, she went back to painting. And you can see here, it's kind of driven by automatic drawing. It's kind of like Gorky. It's kind of like a lot of things. And she lets the paint drip, where it is. There's no deniability. There's no trying to fool the eye. And so abstract expressionism, because of Pollock and his wife and his contemporaries, become really the leading art movement, the avant-garde of the mid-20th century. And so this is another abstract expressionist, Willem de Kooning, Woman One. And basically you can see this is just gesture. And you can see this menacing face, the big breast and everything. Got some characteristics of a woman. People have talked about de Kooning, and maybe analyzing this psychologically, they think maybe he had a fear of women. Look at those eyes, very menacing. Look at those teeth, very sharp, very menacing. Not particularly a smile, but more like a sneer. And so anyway, de Kooning was a colleague of Jackson Pollock. They were friends. They'd known each other for a couple of decades. De Kooning was painting like this, which is more like expressionism, in part because it has the human figure in it. And the idea of abstract expressionism kind of encompasses both this and Jackson Pollock. There were critics at the time that thought that de Kooning was too retro. Retro because he still had a subject here, an image, a woman. And at least according to most of the critics promoting abstract expressionism, many were saying imagery should just go out the window. Any reference to a person, place, or thing is old, passé, tired. And even some went so far to say that when you start to introduce images like this woman here, no matter how much it's distorted for expressive purposes, the fact that it is a woman kind of steps into the realm of literature. And what does literature do? Literature tells a story. It's a narrative painting at that point. So anyway, de Kooning has survived. And the fact that he didn't erase all of his imagery, at least not by 1952, doesn't matter. He's part of the movement. And I got this. Art News from 1982. I don't know if you'd recognize this guy, but he's one of my heroes. Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney and Willem de Kooning. De Kooning pretty much outlived all of the rest of the abstract expressionists. That's a de Kooning painting behind these two gentlemen. Paul McCartney, if you don't know, was one of the Beatles, one of the surviving Beatles, almost 80 years old this year, 79. Anyway, is how big this is. De Kooning as popular as the Beatles, rock and roll. And so what happens is that abstract expressionist, I should say, kind of coalesce. They kind of have a set of values. That it's expressionism, but the second is that this work would not be narrative. It would not have figures. It would not have recognizable images. It would have paint and color and brushwork and all of those elements that cry out, this is a painting. And it's not photography. It's not a narrative. It's not literature. So Joan Mitchell, this becomes part of what would be termed the New York School. And so another abstract expressionist, a guy who was short-lived, you can recognize his work partly because it's usually pretty large, 6 feet, 8 by 8'4", but that it's primarily in black and white. And a lot of people have likened this kind of work to calligraphy or something, but it's expressive. It's abstract, it's expressive. Robert Motherwell, Elegy to the Spanish Republic, yet another first generation abstract expression. Bottom line, these black shapes, Elegy to the Spanish Republic, and I told you earlier about Guernica and the Spanish-American War, and this is an elegy. An elegy means a remembrance, and typically an elegy is a remembrance of things that have passed. So a elegy is kind of like, for a person would be a eulogy. And so bottom line, abstract, color, shape, paint, straightforward, abstract work. And so I showed you a lot of gestural stuff. One of their group, this guy, Barnett Newman, he kind of takes a different approach to this. He uses flat field of color and typically vertical lines to separate this field of color into various squares and rectangles. And they're almost always, but not always, very hard edged. And people ask him and say, well, how do you get these edges so straight? And he said, I use masking tape. And so he got a nickname. This work was called zip paintings because he would have to pull that masking tape down, zip, because in actuality, usually these lines are underpainted. The lines made with masking tape and then overpainted with this red. But this is abstract expressionism. It throws the US into the front row, into the avant-garde, into what was called the advanced art. Why is this important? There was a feeling among philosophers, among artists, among a lot of people that the Second World War had changed so much of humanity. It was a terrible, terrible thing. Many tens of millions of people died in that war. And there were a lot of other changes to boot. After the war, we became polarized. It was kind of a bipolar world, if you will. We got the West and the democracies. We got Russia, the communism, and totalitarianism on the other. A bipolar world. We have, for the first time, the capacity to blow up the whole world in a matter of minutes because of the invention of the atom bomb and the hydrogen bomb. And so people woke up after World War II and said, this is not the same world that we were living in before the war. And as a result, we should have a new art that represents these new times. So this is like the height of modernism, where the new is revered, being new is a goal, new and improved replaces old and outdated. And so anyway, these are the abstract expressionists. And finally, Mark Rothko, another one of their group. You can tell his paintings because they're typically softly painted rectangles, and they're painted in a way that actually make them look like they radiate light, or that you can actually look into the space. As a matter of fact, people talked about this work as being very spiritual. Again, we're still talking about some of the same themes of surrealism. Bottom line is that this was so ripe for meditation that actually they built a chapel in Houston, Texas, specifically to hang Rothko paintings around the perimeter, on all of the walls on all sides, big open space and benches. It's called the Rothko Chapel. And so, New York School, what happens after we have all of these major successful artists? All of a sudden, the artist, the upcoming, the burgeoning artist, were going to New York to learn from the great artist of New York. And it's called the New York School, or in some cases, second generation abstract expressionism. You'll see the dates on these are from the 50s and 60s. Ellsworth Kelly, 1963, kind of taken some of the ideas out of Barnett Newman, but not just limiting himself to a color field and the lines, the zips that run through it. He would do major geometric shapes, irregular geometric shapes, flat color. Second generation, Ellsworth Kelly. And so one of the things that you'll see at this time is that that narrative is pushed out among these artists. They would never think about painting a landscape, a person, a building, anything. Pure. And purity, in some respects, is arrived at through elimination, through the elimination of all that is not necessary, not connected to pure painting, not pointing to something else, but pointing to the painting itself. Frank Stella shaped canvases. It's got and the lines follow the shape of the canvas. It kind of creates an illusion of a three-dimensionality that's actually not really there. But it doesn't have people, doesn't have places, doesn't have things, not a narrative. It's pure. All of that superfluous stuff is stripped out of this work. Helen Frankenthaler, kind of like Jackson Pollock, except that she would roll her canvas out and take acrylic paint and just pour it out by the buckets and pull up on the edges of the canvas to get the paint to flow across the surface. This was called stain painting. And one of the things that happens with stain painting is that most of the colors absorbed in the canvas. And these were typically done on raw canvas. And I'll tell you something. The only reason you can do this is because this is acrylic paint. You couldn't do this with oil paint because the oil paint would rot an unprimed canvas. But this acrylic paint, it does not cause the canvas to biodegrade. And so it's basically, actually, acrylic paint is plastic. It actually just gives it a coat, but bottom line, it sinks into, and these are stain paintings. And again, no other references. They may title this The Bay, but you can't name it. You can't be more specific than that. And so Helen Frankenthaler, second generation. Here's another stain painter. Morris Lewis, kind of painted in the same way. We really don't know how he got this paint to flow in these directions, but stain paintings, and you can see on the perimeter, on the outside edges, the color of the unprimed canvas. And it does some things that painters have been trying to do for centuries as well. And that is create a sense of depth. And these runs of acrylic resin on the canvas, they're so thin, you can see through them. And these were titled, or called, and you didn't title it, veil paintings, because you could almost see through it like you see through a veil. Somewhat obscured, but the sense that there is something behind this paint. Artists have been working with trying to create the illusion of depth for centuries. And so this is kind of a new thing, and it's kind of an old thing too. We have this one here. This kind of comes out of that stuff. This is called op art. And I think to some extent, if you want to kind of compare this to the Frank Stella we saw right here, See how that's giving you an illusion of that this might be three-dimensional, that it actually might be doing these kinds of things. Well, artists like Bridget Riley pick up on that. There's another one, Victor Vassarelli, who does these kinds of things. They were the two major, what we would call op art. And this is just tempera on a composition board. And those dots that she's painting are distorted in a way that makes it look like there's some kind of crease or fold or something, that this is not flat. Again, I was talking about space with Morris Lewis. We're talking about that here too. We're talking about shape and the illusion of three-dimensional shapes. And it's done in the most simple sort of way. And this guy, and there are a lot of these around. David Smith, he actually started off with the abstract expressionist, and his early work is really where he had taken sheets of rolled steel and did automatic drawing on them and cut the steel to the shapes created in the automatic drawing, much like Moreau, much like Calder, much like Arshile Gorky, that kind of these shapes that come out of the subconsciousness. Well, he gave that up in the early 1960s and made these. It's called a Cubi series, and it's stainless steel and it's welded. And this is something that's starting to happen with these artists. They're finding more and more new materials to work with. Stainless steel is new. And so what that allows you to do is that these are hollow. And so you can make these cubes, if you will, and they look like they appear to be very heavy. And they are heavy somewhat, but you can weld them together and it makes them look, in a sense, like Mylar balloons. He's defying their weight. Another thing that he does too, and this is kind of an interesting point, is that he'll do this kind of gestural automatic drawing on the surface with a grinder. And you can do that on stainless steel because it does not rust. So this sculpture looks as good as it did 50 years ago, 60 years ago now. And so anyway, but they're starting to look at the elements: space, shape, weight. All of these elements really start coming to the fore because they wrote out, eliminated all of this referential imagery. I hope that makes sense, because there were critics, and if you really want to take a look at critics like Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried and some others that wrote about this stuff extensively, they thought they were getting to a more pure art. And the fact that once they got rid of all of this other stuff, this narrative stuff, this idea that they need to tell a story, all of these other basic fundamental issues arise: space, light, shape, depth. So, and color, I might add. And so, yeah, Tony Smith, called Die, it's 6 foot by 6 foot by 6 foot. Corten steel. And it rusts, but it's called a patina. It's this kind of oxidation that appears on the surface. Bottom line, You got rid of all of the other stuff. What you got is volume, you got shape, you got weight. And that's kind of all you got. You got fundamental elements because all of the rest of the stuff has been stripped away. Donald Judd, as I was saying, we start focusing on the elements of art, and this is steel brackets. These are like steel boxes here, and there's plexiglass on the tops of these, and there's a pink, purple fluorescent light shining through all of this. The narrative's gone, and what we're dealing with, what we're left to deal with, is, in this case, what you would call rhythm or repetition. Rhythm and movement, that's an issue. Those of you who've taken basic design know that repetition is an element, or it is a device that artists use. They repeat things for the sake of unity sometimes. And in this case, we got the shape, the space, the rhythm, and the light. And what this will lead to is the idea of art being reduced to its basic elements. And that'll be called minimalism, actually. And I'm looking at the clock. I don't have a lot of time. This is Eva Hesse. And basically, this is a piece. It's Hang Up Art Institute. And she's got this steel frame, and she wraps it with actually cloth, probably canvas, and she would put this acrylic resin over the top of it. But what this is, if you want to read it this way, this is a frame where the subject is not this blank space, but it is the real space in which this, it looks like a cord, but it's actually steel. It's not malleable. It's a solid thing. But basically the light, the space, everything exists outside the frame. Well, that's kind of interesting. And so we were talking about elements of composition, and this one, all of the elements are outside the frame. And I was just telling you about minimalism as an outgrowth, and another outgrowth of this will be conceptual art, where so many of the elements are discarded that basically what you have left, the most important thing, the idea, the concept. And when I have some images like that, I'll show you. But this is Louise Nevelson, bunch of found objects all put together, all wooden pieces in boxes, the repetition, it's all painted black. And she's not particularly in the realm of abstract expressionism so much, but in kind of a way. The idea of you would take found random objects and put them together. It's kind of like the squares arranged according to the laws of chance. This is a sculpture arranged according to what I can find when I find it. So, repetition, materials, and let's see. I'm going to stop right here because it's almost 10 after. I want to get any questions you may have, because I see a few of you are here that weren't here before. So, any questions? Well, I'll take that as I explained everything so clearly and perfectly that you got it now. Remember, first of all, no class meeting on Monday. Second of all, I had some entries in quiz 4 that may have been corrupted or otherwise destroyed through the internet. So check it. I opened the site back up. Give me your answer through Friday. I'll be happy to grade them, happy to give you credit. And so, that being said, happy Easter, everyone. Stay safe. Enjoy this wonderful spring weather.
Have a great Easter.
You too, Brooke.
Thanks, John.
You bet, Robin.